Oh, okay.
I'm over in Capitol Hill, basically like H Street adjacent.
Okay. That's what's up, man.
All right. Yeah. Where are you?
I'm in Palo Alto, California.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah, yeah.
Nice.
Been out here
Nice.
for 8 years. It's all right. It'll do.
Sure. Hey, everybody, we're just going to take a second and let people continue to join. Sorry for starting a little late. So maybe we'll start at 2:05 as opposed to 2:03. Really excited to have our guest, Joel Anderson of Slate, to talk about becoming Justice Thomas, which everybody should listen to. So it'll just take a few minutes. And Joel and I are just going to rap for a minute. He said he's out in Palo Alto. I'm here in DC.
Hmm.
I love the Bay. In fact, if I hadn't gotten a job back here, I probably would have stayed for a while longer.
Are you serious? See,
I lived in
okay.
Oakland. I loved Oakland.
Oh man, did you live near the lake? Were you over in
I
like Grand
did.
Lake?
I did. And that was, and, I just sort of
Oh,
chose, yeah, I just randomly, you're like moving across country. You don't know the area. I'd never been to Oakland, but I was like, I want to live in Oakland. And I
yes.
chose what I thought was a random apartment complex. And it turned out it was 3 blocks from the lake. And I was like, this place is magical.
Look at you, man. You know what? We've been here 8 years. We didn't end up in. We ended up at Palo Alto because my wife got a journalism fellowship. But I thought when it was over, I was like, "Oh, we moving back to DC." We came here from DC,
Yeah.
and it didn't happen that way. But we always have been trying to move to Oakland. Always, always, always. It's expensive, man. You know what I'm
I
saying? It's
know.
just very
I
hard to
know
get in
it
over there.
is. Yeah. And it was getting more and more pricey when I was there. So I can only imagine what it's like now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We'll give it one more minute and then get started. Um, but yeah, I absolutely loved it. And that year, maybe apropos of our conversation, was the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, I think. And
Oh
so they were
wow,
all sorts of cool public exhibitions all around the city.
that's so
Yeah, it
great.
was it was a magical time.
Did you ever do the Panther walking tour that they have over there?
I know I didn't. I didn't. Yeah,
And
maybe
we
I was
did
just
that once.
overwhelmed with all the other Panther stuff. I
Yeah, I know. Well, you
didn't
were
know
already there.
about
You
it.
didn't need to. You didn't have to do that. That's for people like us in Palo Alto. You know.
Right, right. Fair enough. But where's it take you? Just sort of.
Yeah, you kind of go around the neighborhood. There's like a bakery that a lot of the Black Panthers used to meet at. There's a bookstore on the
Okay.
tour. I wish I could remember the name of the neighborhood. I'm really bad at that.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I am too.
yeah, I wish I could tell you. But it was, wherever you think. It seemed like an area that people a pretty popular area over in Oakland, but yeah, it was beautiful, man. It was really really dope, and I think they're still doing it. You just you get on the app or whatever, and people can still do it. So if anybody is listening and you have the opportunity to go do the Black Panther walking tour in Oakland, you should absolutely do it.
Yeah, for sure. I'll do it the next time I'm out there.
Yeah, come on.
Well, with that, let me kick this off. I'm Rakim Brooks, president of the Alliance for Justice, which is an association of more than 150 organizations committed to building power, transforming our courts, and securing justice for all. Today's conversation is part of our ongoing Holding Court Justice Conversations with AFJ series, featuring leading activists, scholars, attorneys, and now journalists. And we've had a journalist before in Dahlia Lithwick, and I guess Ellie Mastal is also a journalist. So we got to add that into our intro. But a wide variety of folks who are covering public affairs and just help us to get a better understanding of the state of our world. So with that said, I'm honored to have Joel Anderson with me today on Holding Court to discuss season 8 of Slate's Slow Burn podcast, Becoming Justice Thomas. Joel, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Joaquin, for having me on. It's an honor, seriously. So,
Yeah. Well, so you've been a staff writer for Slate for a while, and you've
mhm.
had several other seasons of Slow Burn, season 3 and season 6, for those who haven't listened to them, and those also had great acclaim. But I'm curious, I listened a little bit about your motivation with Justice Thomas, and you sort of talked about big kind of life events that happened when you were a child that led to this exploration. But maybe you could just share a little bit about that for folks who haven't yet listened to the series.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think, Justice Thomas is one of those people who's been in the news at least so long in my lifetime that you sort of take for granted that you know things about him. I kind of came, I, I remember the confirmation hearing in 1991. I remember
Hmm.
getting the covers of the Emerge magazine. It used to be a
Hmm.
magazine, that was focused for Black folks that my parents subscribed to, and it had him in the image of Aunt Jemima and a lawn jockey, right? And so that's sort of I didn't spend much more time thinking about who he was or where he'd come from, and it was one of the rare times in between work that in projects I was like, well, I'll just going to read up on him a little bit, and people had talked about how fascinating he was and all
Hmm.
this other stuff. And so I started reading a little bit about his background, and yeah, I mean, there was a lot to chew on there, and some of it, I recognize it myself. Like him,
Hmm.
I had to go to a mostly white, all boys, Catholic school in the South. Um, and then, kind of basically the same thing when I went off to college,
Hmm.
and felt real like class envy in a lot of ways,
Hmm. Hmm.
not that my family was broke or anything, we were doing okay. We were, I guess firmly middle class, black middle class, but, being around people, being around wealth and opportunity and just sort of resentment would be too strong of a word, but just taking it in and being like, wow, like they really have some privileges, they really have some advantages, and
Hmm.
why is the world this way? And that's kind of at the point at which we sort of start to depart. Oh, I should also mention, and this is kind of embarrassing to admit in 2023. Well, I shouldn't say it like that, but I fancied myself. If people can take themselves back to the early 90s when there was the Malcolm X Renaissance, when people were
Right.
really interested in Malcolm X or whatever, and
Yeah.
and
X came out and Denzel
X
was
came
out
out,
there. And I
the
am
hat.
Malcolm X.
Yeah, I had the shirt, and I,
Yeah.
fancied myself wanting to join the Nation of Islam or becoming,
Hmm.
Muslim, and a lot of it was because of my anger with, like, what I thought was prejudice or racism that I dealt with at school and stuff like
Hmm.
that. And so, for people that have listened to the season and read about, Clarence Thomas, they know that he, fancied himself in sort of ways or fashioned himself as a Black Panther.
Hmm.
And did all of that. And so, we shared a lot of that. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. But obviously, at a certain point, we went another way. And I kind of, once I read about him, I was like, oh, I want to read more about that and talk to the people that were there and kind of get to the bottom of why they think he departed and
Yeah.
left behind that previous life. So,
Yeah. But that's a perfect setup for the direction I wanted to go in, which is you have a very pivotal moment in the series where you describe the murder of Dr. King as
mm,
kind of setting Justice Thomas off on this path of radicalism as he defines it. And then there are many moments that I love about your version of his life because you elevate things that you say are silences in his autobiography, for instance. And one of those moments is that I can't remember exactly where they were. Maybe it was the other side of Missouri or Kansas. I can't recall exactly, but there's a riot,
yes,
um,
yes.
and or it seems maybe there's a riot.
Right
It
after the kid.
seems
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right after the King assassination, and for Justice Thomas, he says that's the moment that kind of turns him against radicalism. He says, I went home and I prayed and I said, God, if you take this anger out of my heart. And then we sort of seem to be on to the Clarence Thomas that we know today gradually. But I wonder if you could just talk to the audience about that moment, how you saw it. I mean, it seemed so many people took different meanings out of the riots of the 60s. So for um, for someone who had been radicalized by Dr. King's murder to take those moments to then say, "Oh, I'm actually going to be radicalized in an entirely different direction," fascinated me.
Yeah, no, sure. So I'll go back to, so this is, I want to say, 1967, when Clarence Thomas is in seminary it's in rural Missouri. He's
Hmm.
studying to become a priest, and at this point, he's already realized that he's not going to make it. During the King assassination, one of his classmates says, "Well, I'm glad the bastard is dead," or something to that
Right.
effect, right? And it just really shocks him. It shocks his conscience, and he's like, he's already been struggling, realizes he can't do it. And so before he goes home, there is a march or a protest in Kansas City, Missouri, nearby. And he goes to that, and he says it was just really inspiring to be there around all these people who were moved by Dr. King's life and his
Hmm.
cause. He doesn't say anything else about it in the book. You look it up, and you find out, oh, it actually was one of the bloodier, urban riots in American history, and certainly
Hmm.
of that year following King's assassination. He doesn't bring it up at all, right? Because it fits really well with the narrative. But in college, so I think this is 1971, near the end of it, I think it's sophomore year at Holy Cross, which is in, and I'm going to say it wrong. So if y'all are from Boston or whatever, don't hold me to this. It was really tough for me. Worcester, Worcester,
Worcester.
Massachusetts. Worcester, Massachusetts. Yeah, it's hard, but Southern is it's hard for me to
Right.
my Texans. But anyway,
Yeah.
so he's there and he goes to he's in his sort of what he calls his radical phase. He's
Mm-hmm.
protesting racism. He's a member of the Black Student Union at Holy Cross. People would probably consider him an activist, and so he goes to was an anti-Vietnam War demonstration in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it erupts. It becomes a violent, clash between protesters and the police, and
Mm-hmm.
Thomas is in the middle of this. He gets drunk. And he gets home and he's like, "Oh, what have I done to my life? Like, why am I so
Mm-hmm.
angry? I don't understand why I'm so angry." And he really talks about this as like this pivotal moment where he asks God, he's like, "If you take the anger out of my heart, I will never do this again. I will,
Mm-hmm.
follow your path." And so yeah, so at that point, he gets home, he goes to church, um, and says, "It's I'm changed." And he starts to focus on his studies and trying to make a living for himself, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's just interesting that like the king the king riot in Kansas City, that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
come up. Like he wants to paint it as like, oh, this was a really meaningful moment, but this other one, which was a significant disturbance, but it wasn't on the level of the Kansas City one, and he wants to say that, oh well, this was totally out of control. These people had no right to tear up the city like that. Like I don't even understand why they were upset.
Right.
It's just a little too cute. But
Yeah.
it certainly fits with the narrative he wants to tell people.
For sure. One of the things that I think you're so artful about, firstly, when you walk into Mama Thomas's home at the beginning of the
Yeah.
series, I was driving while I was listening to it. I almost pulled over to the side of the road because obviously AFJ has been very focused on that piece of the narrative, and the fact she was so gracious and so welcoming was incredible to me, and that the family was as well. But one of the things that I was curious to get your reaction about, um, part of it seemed, is that that's her boy, right?
Hmm.
Ain't nobody gonna tell her anything about her boy, right? And I appreciated that, and and it reflected in me, and it led me to actually think about many of the things that often aren't discussed about Justice Thomas, just like that town that you were in, and where you would ask questions and people say, "I don't want to talk about Clarence." That there is actually a well-developed, maybe that's not the right way of phrasing it, a kind of uh, persistent strain of conservatism in Black communities
Sure.
that I think often bewilders mainly white liberals, right? Because they're like, well, they're Democrats. So how could it possibly be the case that they hold these views? But those of us who've grown up in Black communities are like, nobody's a monolith. There's actually a wide variety of perspectives. And so I actually expected when you went into the House to hear more kind of just conservative leanings, and you kind of demonstrated some of that with his grandfather and the kind of ways that he viewed the world, that he thought that welfare was an abomination and would create dependency. Did you think about that at all, given your own upbringing and experience, that like this actually isn't that unfamiliar? What might be unfamiliar is for the world to see it on this grand a stage, because it doesn't often kind of make its way beyond the borders of Black communities.
Oh no, it's absolutely very familiar. I think that the confusing thing is that people don't understand that like just because you're a black conservative, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a Republican. Because
Right.
most black people know that the modern day Republican Party is very hostile to black people and our interests here in this country, right? But in terms of conservatism, I mean, dude, I just left my barber shop where my barber was saying, I'm going to pull my, I'm looking to move California because, they've got people, a man wearing dress teaching my kids. And, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
Dame, that's not what's going on here. I'm
Right.
sorry, but the dude does have the
Yeah.
clippers on my head, right? But
Right. Right.
but there are a lot of people in the conservatism takes a lot of different forms. A
Yeah.
lot of conservative folks are in the Nation of Islam. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that like Louis Farrakhan is fairly conservative in his politics,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they just apply like what he wants to see for black people is something that a lot of white people agree with, so they don't think of him as a
Mm-hmm.
conservative. Jim Brown was a conservative. He supported Republican politicians at some point in
Mm-hmm.
his life. So it totally confuses people. But if you are around black people and if you've been grown up around them, you come to learn that you know, uh, cons- trying to break down black people that way. Like that's not, it's not, it's, if you think of it only in terms of the two-party system, it will confuse you. But like black
Right.
people are very, very complicated with our politics in terms of immigration, abortion, welfare. I mean, some of the ugliest things I've ever heard people say about people on welfare from black people, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, man, it absolutely felt very interesting, and I'm glad you asked me about this too, because one thing that I think that was sort of confusing to me as I was reading, and it became clear to me, is that I thought Clarence Thomas was totally a creation of white institutions, right? That like
Hmm.
he had been
Hmm.
passed through these schools, and the Republicans had recruited him and groomed him the entire way. And I wasn't thinking about how he grew up, but when you talk to the people he grew up with and went to school with, like he's very much a part of like the black community in Savannah, and like the
Hmm.
families, and like he's not uncomfortable being around black people. He has had black friends, black partners,
Hmm.
everything else. Like he's very much a part of it. It's just that like you kind of forget that when he's been
Right.
sort of at the center of power for so long. But no, that's, I hate to say, that's a black dude. That's a black ass dude. Clarence Thomas. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
So yeah.
there's an amazing moment. I don't know if it came up in your journalism because you sort of stopped by the time that he's nominated, but where he's addressing, I think, the National Bar Association, and given all the descriptions you've given of the different renderings of him as an Uncle Tom and so forth, he has a very candid moment where he says something to the effect of, "You can't imagine how much it pains me to be separated from you all in this way."
Mhm.
And so to me, it wasn't surprising that you found this kind of wealth and rootedness from the community from which he came, even though he's far flung from there now.
I think he would love nothing more than to be embraced by black people, man. Like I think it
Mm,
really is a real source of pain for him, because I think that he is sincere in his desire to help black people, but that
mm,
it has been corroded so much over the years that it has kind of bent in the opposite direction. And there's also like a lot of anger and resentment that goes
yeah.
along with that has sort of perverted that earlier concern. But I still think that that's there, that he would like to, have you I don't well I don't I, yeah, DC has like gas stations or whatever, and people sell the
Hmm.
t-shirt out there, and it'll be Obama, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Like he would
Right.
love to be the fourth dude on that Black Mount
Right.
Rushmore, right?
Yeah.
But that's just not, because of who he's been over the last 30 years and even more, that it's just not going to happen. But yeah, I
Yeah.
what you heard in his voice there, that I believe that to be really sincere.
Yeah. I mean, now I've gone off script because I knew this was the conversation I was going to have with you, but I'm just add this one piece to keep it moving. Uh, when we had the Museum of African American History and Culture, and they didn't include him at the first
Yeah,
time, if you remember that.
I do. I do.
So yeah, so I think you're exactly right that the alienation is profound. But I wanted to take us from Holy Cross, from this moment of kind of self-realization. So then he goes to my alma mater, Yale Law School,
Nice.
which, yeah, well, you say so, but we've produced
Yeah.
we've produced a lot of ill in the world as of late.
I mean,
To
all the schools do, man. All of them
So
at the end of the day.
but you say
Yeah.
that, but then I have to be like, oh, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas and
Yeah.
Josh Hawley giving people the thumbs up, like so.
I mean, y'all
But
are punching outside of y'all weight class. I will give
yeah,
you
right,
that. Yeah. Right.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So Yale Law School, let's try to do better. But so he gets to Yale, and it seems he has a fine experience there. I mean, he's got the questions. I mean, one of the things that was most interesting to me about that experience is, given where he was raised and the people that he was raised around, his granddad telling him not to make any excuses, he seemed so sensitive to the hostility of racism that he
Hmm.
felt, maybe because it was unexpected in the same way that it wasn't in seminary. Whereas when I was coming up and I was going to various institutions, my grandparents sort of told me, like, you're there to get an education. My mother says, you're there to get an education. And he says almost nothing in his entire history. I mean, when he puts that kind of 15-cent cigar sticker on his Yale diploma, I was sort of like, did you not learn anything the whole time that you were there that you thought was valuable? That sort of, I mean, regardless of how you were treated, right? Was the
Right.
education worthwhile? So I found myself, I didn't know if you explored that at all, what his relationship might have been in his classes, how he performed, whether or not whether the professors thought that he was bright and capable.
So We did do a little exploration at that time, and I think
So many of the Yale law, just so the audience knows, so many of the Yale law professors that probably taught Clarence Thomas are still there.
oh
So
yeah,
you actually could have some continuum.
yeah, and the thing is I think what the issue is that a lot of people that Clarence is not great at vocalizing his resentment or his pain, right?
Hmm.
So to the people that he was around, he was a jocular guy. Like at one point, he was wearing like a straw hat and overalls
Hmm.
on campus, like really playing up the Georgia
Hmm.
bumpkin thing, right? Like people can remember him being on campus doing that sort of stuff, and that he got along with people and was very active in other groups or whatever. But inside, at least according to him, and if you read his memoir, he talks about how it was a really miserable time. And you can kind of understand this because he's married by then, okay? And
Hmm.
he has a young son while he's in law school, his only son. So
Hmm.
he's broke. He's not doing very well. He's estranged from his grandfather because his grandfather wanted him to finish at the seminary. He didn't want him
Hmm.
to do all this other stuff, and so there's still some estrangement there. And then, of course, he's dealing with what he believes is racism and people that, as you mentioned, like they get there, they think of him as merely there because of affirmative action, and that he's not qualified, and so all of that sort of curdles
Hmm.
inside, but that is not what he projected to people. So I think that's just sort of the dichotomy, right? Like people didn't, you could ask, your average classmate of his, oh, Clarence was fine. They say that at Holy Cross. They say that to an extent at the seminary, that they had no idea that all of this was going on inside of him. So he's really
Hmm.
good at projecting himself as sort of a amiable fellow. Anybody that has met Clarence Thomas in person, to a person, says
Oh,
that he is
absolutely true.
a very polite, warm, kind person, like, interpersonally. Like anybody will say that. But I think it's if you get to know him a little bit more and you get to a little bit more to the surface, then all of that other stuff sort of starts to come out. And so,
Yeah, no, I've met him several times, and he's a
oh,
pleasant, jovial person. Kind of nice to be around. If
yeah.
you.
Well, Rakim, so when I did this series, a guy reached out to me. He was a black attorney. I cannot remember where he is, but he's in DC now. And he said that he wrote a letter to Clarence Thomas saying that he disagreed, with something or whatever, but that he, still respected his journey or whatever. And Clarence Thomas welcomed him to his chambers and
Mhm.
kept up sort of a mentorship with him over the years. And he's just like,
Hmm.
that's the sort of the other side of Clarence Thomas that people don't see. And I mean, it's good that you're nice to specific people, right? It's really nice that you
Right.
can be good individually to people, but that doesn't have a lot to do with what he's done now that he has some power or influence, right? But yeah, you're right. I'm sure I would. There's a part of me that would like to actually meet him and talk with him. I'm sure it
Hmm.
would be really interesting. But I we both know not to be fooled by that, right? So
Well, I would say, you know, I have to. How should I even put this? I'm almost at a loss for words. Just applaud you for the level of even-handedness and neutrality throughout the series. There would be some moments where I felt like I know what Joel really thinks about this, but I actually thought that it was a journalist's um, sort of finest hour, that you went in and recorded
Thank you.
this entire event, and like tried to trace this man's life with a great deal of humility and sensitivity to the sources and the people that were around him, and tried to let their voices kind of stand in for your, or not even stand in, lifted them up so that they were representative of what people really felt and not what you felt. And so I walked away from it thinking, this is probably the first time I've heard a black person talk about Clarence Thomas for 4 hours, and not, not since extraordinary rage about what it is he said, short of Thomas Sowell and a few other people. But so kudos to you for
Well,
that effort.
well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm of two minds about that, right? I'm like, man, well, I'm glad that you could see the journalism that I was sort of being patient.
Mhm.
You don't throw the when you box, you don't just lead in with uppercuts, right? You got to jab a little.
Mhm.
But also, I mean, obviously, I am, 180 degrees different from him politically, right?
Mhm.
Like, but I wanted to be fair. I thought the important thing was to be fair. And, there are people in his life um, that hold him in high regard, people that care about him. And there's also people that you could it's inarguable he's hurt, and
Hmm.
and the things that he believes in, the policies are supported that have hurt, untold, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. But to get people to talk to me, right?
Hmm.
Um, to uh, to not get people to just get fixated on the rage, but to find out how a person can end up like this, right? Like maybe there's a
Hmm.
lesson
Hmm.
in there. So like I didn't want to get into, man, that dude's a, I didn't want to, do a podcast that was the cover of the Emerge magazine,
Right. Right.
which I still have a lot of respect for. Like what they did, I thought was very courageous, at the at that time and today. But
Hmm.
I had another aim in mind, I think. So,
Yeah.
but thank you for
You
saying that,
know,
man. Seriously.
oh no, I'm happy to, and maybe it's because I see some of myself reflected in what you achieved, in that it used to, for all of my disagreements with him, which are profound, and we've run a campaign saying Justice Thomas should resign, and we can talk about why we did that, or the revelations that happened after you, or just before you, I guess you all launched the episodes, or right around the same time.
Yeah.
But I resented from the time I was in high school, maybe, when disproportionately white colleagues would say that he was unintelligent. I mean, I
Yeah.
thought there were so many other things to complain about,
Yeah.
right? That no one
Yeah.
said that about Justice Scalia. Nobody said that about Justice Rehnquist. And I appreciated that you just drew out through it. It was like a throwaway line, like, just so you know, he won an award in Latin. And I was
Yeah.
like, see?
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but that kind of mixture, that's why I was focused on the Yale period and kind of the period after that. Like, what strange combustions took place that led to new configurations of who he might be, is that he has the experience at Holy Cross. I mean, one, he's discriminated against in the South, right? He grows up
Right.
in the Jim Crow era and thereafter. And so then he goes up north, and it's like, Dr. King deserved to die. And he's like, okay, I'm hearing it here. Then I go to Yale Law School. People are saying I'm this, that, and the other. Then I graduate from Yale Law School, and I can't get a job. And the one person willing to offer me a job is this Republican senator, or soon to be senator, he's not there yet, Senator Danforth. And it always felt like this toxic brew to me to throw onto that thereafter. Well, in spite of all of his achievements and accomplishments, he's not that intelligent. He just sort of got on the shorter line. Julian
Yeah.
Bond, who I very much respect, once said, when somebody said, why did Clarence Thomas go to that side? He said, well, the line on that side is shorter, right? Saying that the talent that tries to move itself through the Democratic Party is, a much larger group than the talent that tries to move itself through the Republican Party. Whether surely that's true, I guess.
Yeah. No, I
but
agree.
but
I
again,
agree. I agree. I agree.
but
I
again, it
agree.
didn't mean that he was unintelligent. So anyway, that's what I'm sort of reflecting back, that I thought you revealed him in his full humanity in spite of all the complexity. And I think too often that gets kind of truncated into something that's bite-sized and if not digestible, at least something that you could chew on and spit out.
Well, I'm going to ask you about it because if you experienced that at Yale or all the way around, but the one thing about Clarence Thomas is that people can't deny is that dude worked hard. From the
Mhm.
very beginning, like he was a standout student, from elementary school, at high school when he went to the Black Catholic school in Savannah, to when he, like you said, when he won a Latin award
Mhm.
he won the Latin B at the white seminary in Savannah. And I mean, he goes on to school. He's always was an academic standout. So yeah,
Mhm.
you're right. I'm glad you mentioned that because I will recoil when you start talking about any black person being not smart or dumb. Like I mean,
Mhm.
I will have to get verification. Like I need to meet this person.
Right.
Like let me see some samples of writing. At least talk about something. But you're right. Like it does annoy me when people try to impugn his intelligence because um, I mean, look who our most recent president was. You know what I mean? Like it's not like you all are not,
Right.
like pretending at intelligence is, something that like we see now that like Republicans and people that are conservatives they don't even care about that. Like when Sarah
Yeah.
Palin was up for anyway, I don't want to get too far afield, but
No, no,
so
I hear
for
you.
so for them to put that on Clarence Thomas, I'm like, where are you getting that from? Like, why do you like couldn't it not be that he and Alito or whoever, like they're just aligned necessarily, they're
Right.
aligned. It doesn't mean that that anybody's following anybody or anything else. Like he's an I'm not going to say a heavyweight, but he's a smart guy in his own right. And I mean, I don't. You can argue about whether or not you think he deserved to have made it to the Supreme Court, but that's besides the point at this point. Like
Yeah,
he's smart. He's smart enough to be there. Now, what he's done now that he's there, that has not a lot to do with intelligence. So
right. So I'm gonna combine a few different things quickly in the interest of time, which is I thought you provided one of the sort of like most incisive examinations that I've seen on Clarence Thomas and ambition, as
mm,
told by the people around him, right?
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
person who said, he says, I never imagined I could do this. And you got somebody from the EEOC in the early 1980s saying, like, day one when he walked in here, he
Oh yeah,
said, I could sit on the Supreme Court one
yeah.
day, right?
Absolutely.
And and then there's a conversation with his ex-girlfriend about how that sort of transfigures him. He becomes something other than what she thought he really was, and it had to do with the laugh and these other pieces. So I wondered, after doing all this research, is there a story to be told about this is the result of one Black man's ambition, that he took this path and was rewarded and rewarded and rewarded, and now what we witness is sort of, but that's the driving force, that somebody can be ambitious and they will follow the paths that are open to them, and we should be alert to that for all people.
Absolutely. That's a really insightful way to look at it. I mean, so if you go back to his childhood, it was always thought that Clarence Thomas was different from the others. And if you hear the episode one,
Mm-hmm.
when he's at the seminary, one thing that they used to try to recruit other Black, seminary students was like, you could be like Clarence Thomas. They had Clarence Thomas go talk to other kids at Black schools
Mm-hmm.
in Savannah, trying to recruit them to go to seminary, right? And so he always has thought of himself as special, and people have always treated him as if he was special or unique, right? And so, absolutely, like when he gets through uh, Holy Cross, he's a standout there. One of the top students, graduates near the top of his class, all that thing. And then when he gets to Yale, like all of a sudden, people are starting to question whether or not he belongs there, and he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
get the same opportunities as everybody else. He the only job offer that he says that he got was to work at John Danforth's office as the Attorney General in Missouri. And so I think that 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 desire to be recognized, to be seen as different from everybody else, has always sort of fueled him and
Mm-hmm.
guided his choices. And then along the way, he had to make some compromises. Like he didn't want to run the EEOC, you
Mm-hmm.
know, he didn't want to work in the Office of Civil Rights in the Reagan administration, but he did it knowing that it was going to lead to something that would set him apart from other people. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there actually is a time, that is not often discussed, him working in Monsanto. After he leaves Danforth's office in the Attorney General in Missouri, he starts working at Monsanto, the chemical giant or whatever, and he gets a little bit of taste of what it's like to make money and to
Mm-hmm.
be, have a little money and to have a little influence in town. And my boy is the senator,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm making this money. And so he gets to see what it's like to be a person that can connect people and be somebody that is in demand. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that like his ambition has absolutely driven him to this point. He always knew that he was going to have some power and influence. It was just a matter of who was going to give him the opportunity first.
Yeah. You keep laying the breadcrumbs for me, so I'm gonna just take this one and keep going. That you raising his working for Monsanto was fascinating to me because it is something that I didn't know about him
Mm-hmm.
and hadn't read elsewhere. Most people talk about his path from John Danforth to the EEOC. And so I'm going to pivot now to kind of current events
Okay,
with
yeah, yeah,
regard to Justice Thomas. And one of our big critiques at the Alliance for Justice is that you could sit on the Supreme Court and be basically broke. You got family
yeah.
wealth and other things that you might have, and all the accoutrements that go with being a Supreme Court justice, right? All the pageantry.
Yeah,
Or you just go make a lot of money.
right.
What you can't do, in our opinion, it's not Joel, this is the Alliance for Justice. You can't have somebody else help you be rich in a way that seems to
Yeah.
conflict with your public obligations. Okay,
Yes.
rant over. But it led me to ask the question, and you can reflect on that more generally if you'd like, but let me just start here. why does he leave Monsanto? So here he is, this poor kid. He's now making all this money. The senator is his boy and is going to continue to be his boy. He's going to be the senator for a long time, as we know.
Yeah.
And yet he decides, no, I'm going to go join the Reagan administration, registers just before and changes his registration to Republican. It's like, I'm going to go join the Reagan administration. Did you get any sense of that? Because that was the first time where I was thinking, he actually could have just been rich. I mean, he didn't have to do it quite this way.
Oh, absolutely. And it obviously, it had been his desire for money and lack of it is like an ongoing thing throughout his life. Like throughout the 80s, one of the people that we talked to, Lily McEwen, who's his ex-girlfriend, who is, I mean, just a firecracker. If you listen to the episode 3, she says a lot of deep stuff about him. She talks about loaning him money so that he could be eligible for one of the judicial positions that they wanted to elevate him to in the Republican administration. Like he's always needed this money. He does not come from money, you know? And so why do I think he left Monsanto? I think that it's two things. I think he wanted to have influence too, right? Yeah, I think he's like, well, what good is it being rich if I don't have, you know, if I don't have a place in government and can influence law, right? He's an attorney. Yeah. So I think he was really interested in like being able to make a difference through law as well. Because the things that he believes in, you know, I think he's sincere about that. Like, I think he really does believe that affirmative action is bad for Black people. I really do, you know, believe that women should not have access to abortion. You know, I really believe he believes these things. And so it's just tough to have money and make an influence there. But if you can somehow thread the needle, like he's tried to do, right, then you can maybe do both. And like he figured out a way that he can maybe do a little bit of both. And, you know, I mean, I don't, you know, I guess what he makes a few $100,000 a year doing what he does. And that's still a pretty comfortable life. And his, you know, Jenny Thomas, his second wife, she comes from a family with a lot of money. They were Republican donors going back to the 50s and 60s. Like they gave money to the Goldwater campaign, right?
Right.
So you know what kind of Republican, you know what time it is with them. So he's had a comfortable life, but he also, like, you know, he hangs out with Harlan Crow and some of these other cats, and they going to Bora Bora. You know, they're going on a yacht, and he wants to live that life. But I don't think he needs so much that he had to become a $1 million attorney. He could just do both. And like, I mean, it seems like for his purposes, it all worked out. Like,
it seems like it's working out quite well, right?
Yeah, who's gonna check him? You know, so yeah.
Yeah, well, we're trying. We're doing our best.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that efforts. Of course.
But so you kind of got the Midas touch. Like you choose these topics, and then things happen in the world around them. So when the ProPublica reporting started, what did it lead you to reflect on first in all the accounting and journalism that you had done of Justice Thomas's life? Did it lead you to any particular incident or memory and think like, that's spot on, sure he did this, or that's in conflict, that doesn't sound right, or I was just at his mama's house and I didn't know somebody else owned it?
Well, you know, I mean, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, you know, I was at his mom's house, and it just was so, like you have a perception of like the people that you think are famous or influential in this country. You think, okay, well, they've been making good money for a while now. They've been doing well. They're in the public spotlight. Like I'm assuming their family is doing pretty well. And I stand outside of his mom's house, which was formerly his grandfather's house, and I'm like, oh, is this it? I mean, like all this time, like this is where his mom lives. Like that's where, you know, my mom, you know, lives in a house like that, you know? And so you can see that like, no matter what opportunities, no matter what, you know, position that he's held in this country, you know, for the last 30, 40 years, that it still doesn't mean that, you know, his family has been able to come along on that journey with him. Right. And you think about how perilous this all is, how tenuous it all is, and like his connection to like Black poverty in the South. Like I was like, wow, that's just, he is of that generation. He's not even a generation out of it. So you can see how that might have happened. But in terms of my own reporting, you know, one friend, pointed out that they went and visited him when he was working for John Danforth, um, in Jefferson City, Missouri, and he goes in there, and where he previously he'd visited, Clarence in his dorm room at Holy Cross at Yale, and he had like a poster of Malcolm X up, and all of a sudden he has up a poster of a BMW in his house.
Right.
Right, where things start to change for him, and I really think that that time at Monsanto is really pivotal to understanding a lot of this because at one point he told his brother while working for Monsanto that his brother would get more conservative as soon as he started paying taxes to finance
Mm-hmm.
Democratic dreams, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that like the influence of all that money and the Republicans, the Republican machine around him starts to like, okay, like I need to be serious about trying to make some money for myself because that's
Yeah.
one way people will respect me, one way people will listen to me. So
Yeah. For folks who are listening, you should take an opportunity if you'd like to submit any questions that I can pose to Joel, maybe in the next few minutes. I'm gonna hit on some of the more fun questions that my staff wanted me to ask.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
So what was in episode 1 or 2, Clarence goes up to his roommate and says they call me Coos, and it's about Bob Cousy. So somebody asked, can Clarence Thomas dunk? Did any of your research suggest that he's got hops?
It's funny because we did a live show in DC back in July, and the scripted portion of the evening actually addresses this very question. So if you look in one of the seminary yearbooks, there's a picture of Clarence Thomas allegedly dunking. Like it's got, you can see the top half of his body and his
Yeah.
arms hanging on the rim or whatever. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, it's they're implying that Clarence Thomas can dunk. But the guy that you're referring to from that story is Eddie Jenkins. He was a
Hmm.
friend of his at Holy Cross. Ended up playing a little bit in the NFL. He played for the 1972 Miami Dolphins and got a Super Bowl ring and everything, right? And he was just like, he was quick, he was fast, he was strong. I don't think he could dunk.
Right.
And his friend from the seminary, Clarence Thomas played on a basketball team at the seminary in Missouri, and he was like, well, he was really good. I never saw him dunk, but it's possible. Like they think it's possible, but we have no evidence whatsoever.
No real evidence.
But I will say that like it's kind of shocking. Like I had to kind of come to grips with it, but everybody was like, Clarence Thomas was a great athlete, man. That they said that he was
Oh yeah,
legitimately
that's
like,
something they always talk about, and how much he loved to lift weights and how.
yeah, yeah. I mean, Eddie Jenkins, the football player, he was like, he thought Clarence Thomas was such a good athlete that he asked him to come out for the football team. Like he was like, yo, you can
Oh
help us.
wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And but he was like, Clarence couldn't take a hit. So, which is, I mean, literally and figuratively, he
Yeah.
doesn't like taking hits. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me. I got another. It'll be my own personal funny question at the end. But so you started off by saying you remembered the Supreme Court hearings, right?
Yes.
So now you get to do your own in-depth analysis, right? You've got other people's journalism. We've all read other accounts, but you're probably one of the rare individuals that like went to the primary sources and tried to do your own thing. I know Anita Hill didn't speak to you, but you had many other people who did in the process. And so what about your perceptions of the hearings changed? Is there anything that you learned that sort of felt different? I was trying to think for myself if I had ever had an experience like that. Like it would be my equivalent of a real memory I have was I've been telling people as of late was Bush v. Gore. I was
Yeah.
like that nerdy kid who I stayed up at night and I watched, and then we woke up and we didn't have a president. I was too young to know that you're supposed to have a president the next day, like every time, right? I was like, every time the next day there should be
Right.
a president. So
Transfer
I was
power.
like, yeah, but you can, like you said, you can see how the adults respond, and you're like, oh, this is big, something's happening. So I was just obsessed with it. But I've always wondered, like, if I had the opportunity, this is what you made me think about, like to go to Florida and to go to Miami-Dade and like actually talk to the people who had to look at these hanging chads myself. And there's been
Right.
all sorts of reportage done on it already. But that's why I'm curious. Did anything in your own personal process and understanding of the events change? Did you remember something and say, like, that was wrong? I thought
Well,
they said this, but that wasn't true, or that was overemphasized.
so I have to admit, like, when the confirmation hearings happened in 91, I'm 13 years old. And my construction of the life is that my belief in life is I was like, man, why are white people always messing with black people? You know what I mean? Like I'm kind of coming up. You know, my parents grew up in Arkansas and Louisiana, and so you know, in Houston, there had been a guy that wanted to run for mayor, and his campaign got derailed by some revelations that later proved not to be true in court, right? And so this kind of stuff kind of you play with me. So when Clarence Thomas is being accused of sexual harassment, I'm like,
Mhm.
where'd they find this woman from? You know what I mean? Like, or
Mhm.
why are they? What's going on here? This seems. Why did this happen now? Like, why didn't people get to the bottom of this before? And obviously, as I got older and got more of an understanding of it, I, you know, I started to believe Anita Hill more, basically. But
Mhm. Mhm.
at the time, I didn't quite have that viewpoint. And I think the one thing that really, we interviewed Suki Hartnett. She worked for Clarence Thomas at the EEOC.
Mhm.
And a black woman, she graduated from Southern Law School, was an attorney in DC for a number of years. And the one thing that was missing, the piece of it that was missing, that none of us could have known at the time, was that there were other women that were willing to testify about
Right.
how he had treated them, right? Like, asking them out for dates, making inappropriate comments, waiting for them after work, trying to get them to, asking them to do ostensibly professional obligations that ended up being a
Mhm.
lot more personal, right? His interest was in them. And so I'm, at the time, I'm looking at Anita Hill, I'm like, what? What? I mean, he's not trying, Clarence Thomas can have anybody. Why is he messing with this one woman? You know how it always happens, in
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
in the ether. But I really the missing piece was those other women, and that he had other women that the Democrats were prepared to introduce other women into the confirmation hearings. Angela Wright, who also had worked for Clarence Thomas, and she was ready to testify and everything else, and the Democrats backed down at the last minute. They didn't call them to testify. So I think not only would it have helped my memories of those events and the way that I thought about them over time, I think it would have helped everybody else. I think it would have
Yeah.
helped Americans that if these women had had their day before the cameras, I think it would have gone a long way to how we think about Clarence Thomas. And it could have been that we may remember Clarence Thomas like we remember Robert Bork, a guy that got nominated
Right.
but ultimately didn't serve. So
Yeah. Didn't succeed.
yeah, getting to talk to those women, and Miss Hartnett, that really was a pivotal piece of reporting for me, at least, I think.
Yeah. I was only what 4 or 5 when this happened, but
Hmm.
I remember as clearly as you can remember a memory that much of it might be fictitious. But I remember my grandmother sitting there and saying, "No woman would lie about this on national television."
Yeah.
And then saying like no black woman especially would lie about this on national television. I mean, they were I could even feel even then how impressed they were with her bravery to sit under those lights and say something that could destroy her career as far as they were concerned, as far as
It
because it
basically
wasn't.
did.
Yeah.
It basically
Right.
did. Yeah. Hmm.
um so you sort of end the Slow Burn podcast with his ascension to the bench, a few more reflections. If there had been an episode 5 pulling in much of what you know now, let's both his sort of judicial career. And what I appreciated, I should say, I'm getting some questions in the comments, and I want to draw a thread for the audience. Joel and I talked a little bit about this beforehand. So you're not a lawyer, you're not a
No.
legal scholar, and so much of what you did in this was just straight reporting about the person. And
Hmm.
I thought that that was a necessary kind of corrective, not to humanize him in a sense to make us sympathetic in any sense to what he had gone through at various points in his life, but so that you could kind of see the full picture and where he sits in relation to these other interests that now are playing their way out before the court. So, yeah, if there was an episode 5, were there threads that you wanted to follow further into his career? Um, that now that he is that influential person who can make changes, right? He's no longer being acted upon, he's acting on the rest of us. And
Yeah.
that's very different from him from every kind of moment prior to that confirmation.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I kind of have a vision of, I don't, it didn't happen, but like kind of centering it around the January 6th insurrection, because of his wife's involvement in it, his refusal to recuse himself of any of the
Mm-hmm.
cases related to it. The fact that a lot of the people that served under Trump, um, were people that worked for him as clients. Like it kind of
Hmm.
gets to the way
As
that
law
he's been
clerks.
his law
Hmm.
clerks, right? The way
Hmm.
that the way that he's been able to influence a generation of right wing law, and his influence over all these people. I mean, Donald Trump himself has said that if he when nominating judges, like the one that he sort of uses as the model is Clarence Thomas, right?
Hmm.
So it says a lot about who he is and what he's become over the last 30 years being in that seat. That he's been able to have this much influence, and he's
Right.
just sort of been unaccountable. And I think that I probably would have focused around that, and also maybe the role of Jenny in
Hmm.
radicalizing him, because she grew up a true believer, man.
Right.
And so in investigating that relationship a little bit more, and how it catapulted it along, and how it helped connect him to all these other Republican donors, and how they've been able to sort of move things around. I think that it probably would have been a lot like that, which in a way is still sort of a personal story, right? Talking
Hmm.
about Jenny Thomas, like that still is sort of grounded in the way I wanted to tell this story. So um,
Yeah.
you put me on the spot. I didn't have
No, no, no.
I didn't have
I was
episode 5
curious.
outlined, but yeah,
Well,
I think that
yeah, I
that probably would
mean,
have been it. Yeah.
yeah, the reason I asked the question about ambition earlier is because there are moments where, just as we talk about what a second Trump presidency might mean for the country, I think people are inattentive to what going on 30 plus years of
Yes.
Clarence Thomas has meant to the country. And the reason that these biographical pieces told exactly as you told them, neutrally and with with deep humanity, makes a difference is because to me it shows how dangerous someone can become if they are ambitious and uh, um, mistreated in various ways and the recipient of all sorts of scorn and slights because not every person is strong enough to have those things bounce off them and continue on their path, committed to the things that they were always committed to. People will make twists and turns. And so now, as you say, he's kind of amassed this army of law clerks who believe what he believes, as far
Hmm.
as we know. And his ambition has led him to a particular place in our democracy that allows him to wreak havoc. And it's that kind of confluence of events that interests me, candidly. I mean, I have an advocacy position on it, but it's always trying to understand that one of my friends, a social psychologist, uses that quick phrase, hurt people, hurt people.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
And
that's right.
so,
That's
and
real.
so part of me, as I was listening to the whole series, I was listening to it with that in mind. Like, is this a hurt person acting out all of their hurt on the rest of us? Right? None of us get to go to Holy Cross or the seminary ever again because somebody mistreated him there. The value of the education at Yale isn't worth it because you might be mistreated there. If I couldn't get a job when I got out, it means that none of you will potentially get a job, and that's not a worthwhile social project of any kind. You sort of see where I'm headed. That's where I
Yes.
left it as an advocate and someone who's interested in these issues. And I was just curious where you kind of left off as a journalist.
Yeah, no, I agree with your assessment. I find him pitiable, in a lot
Mm,
of ways. Like his life was hard. He seemed uncomfortable in his own skin, and he spent most of his life trying to prove to people that he's good enough, that he belongs, and he's rejected in a lot of the time along that path. His white classmates don't want to deal with him. He's estranged from his grandfather. Like he finds out that the white Republicans that he's trying to make inroads with still think of him as an affirmative action hire, right?
mhm.
They don't think very much of his intellect either. So to your point about the way people are treated, I'm trying to with the way my father phrased this, but he said sometimes, son, you got to give a man a way back. Like when you
Mm,
got, what I mean, where you just can't, you giving up on people makes them really dangerous, right? And I'm not going to say that if people had been nicer to Clarence Thomas, that he would be
right.
less dangerous. But I am saying that, like, it's clear that the slights and the resentment that he's faced has hardened him to people and their plight in this country. And that, I don't know what the lesson, maybe the lesson is that, we still need to work on people. We can't give up on them, right?
Mhm.
Or we need to give them a way back home. I don't know. It might have not made a difference here, but that's kind of what I think, that, like, the hate, you know, the, the hate that fueled him is the hate he's turning back on the rest of us, man. So, you know, I, I, maybe there is not a lesson. Like maybe there's nothing that could be done, but it's clear that like that is a person that has taken all the slights, all the arrows over his life, and it's now we have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And yeah. So anyway, I don't know. Yeah, but the way you said it, I really, really that was an insightful pull. I like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Well, my last question was just going to be, did they tell you that he comes to like the family barbecue? Because we let everybody come back to the family
You
barbecue.
know
I
what?
mean, where they like, oh, every couple of years we have this like all black barbecue, and him and Jenny come on down
I
just like
mean,
everybody else.
the only way he's going is if it's in Savannah. You know, he got people in Savannah that'll look out for him. I don't think,
Yeah.
maybe, I mean, there are some, the black conservative crew is probably thicker than, they can probably, get enough people together, but I don't even think he would, at this point, I don't even think he wants to go because, he avoids conflict now. Like you don't see
Yeah.
him going out, giving interviews, being in places where people will yell at him or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
He don't want to risk that. So the thing is, if you go to the barbecue, somebody will be like, hey, Clarence, I've been waiting to see you for,
Yeah.
5 years,
I've got something to say.
I got something to say to you, so he ain't putting himself out there like that.
That's fair enough. Well, this has been fun. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, Rakim, my pleasure, man. Thanks for making time for me, man. And again, I want to George Kassouf, man. He was so fun to talk to for one, and
Yeah.
so he did the Lord's work, man. Like that was, it may have not turned out the way that we thought it would at the time, but him elevating Anita Hill's story,
Yeah.
it should have gone much differently, and he feels that way as well. But
No,
I
I'm glad
appreciate
you
you trying
raised
to
it.
do.
Yeah, George Kassouf was, for folks who don't know, was a staff member of the Alliance for Justice and was in the Slow Burn podcast. You'll hear that he was responsible for unearthing the allegations that Anita Hill would bring forward, the truthful allegations, as far as I'm concerned, about what Justice Thomas had done to her while employed at the EEOC. But I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and say, be sure to keep following Alliance for Justice on social media to stay up to date on future events. Please do follow Joel. By Joel Anderson on, is that right? By Joel Anderson? Yeah,
Yes,
on
that's
Twitter. Yeah,
Yep.
follow his reporting. You can visit afj.org or slate.com for more information on our organizations and sign up for newsletters, etc. This has been really incredible. Like I said, people won't believe this. I don't spend more time thinking about Justice Thomas or the conservatives on the Supreme Court than I have to. So the idea that we were like, let's do a holding court with Joel, I was like, come on.
I spent 6 months with him. So
I know I
hadn't
even listened to the podcast, and I was like, you know what? But I was so much rewarded for having done so. So shout out to the staff and shout out to you for taking the time, taking those 6 months to do this work.
My pleasure, brother. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone. And I appreciate the work that you guys do there too, man. It's really important. And, I'm glad you all are there. You're standing in the breach, so to speak. So.
I appreciate that. Well, let's stay in touch. I'm looking forward to your next project.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch for sure, bro.